All right, Stanton, haven't you noticed it's all about the dopamine? Apparently.
That was what Nora Volkow said back in the New York Times in 2007.
Yeah, and Nora Volkow doesn't really speak that way so much anymore, but never fear. There's always, I mean, of course she does. I saw your face.
Back and forth.
But she speaks sensibly as well, and she's having sort of a, I don't know what you call it, some sort of a crisis of meaning in her mind. But there's a new person who's very bullish about the idea of dopamine, and she's not so new. Her name's Anna Lembke. She's written books about the so-called opioid crisis. She's a psychiatrist. She's chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. So, you know, people know her. And she's written, I think, best-selling books. One is called Dopamine Nation. And the other book is called Drug Dealer MD. It's all about why doctors, you know, we do have an opioid crisis and doctors caused it. She was on recently the Joe Rogan Experience. And Joe Rogan, and you mentioned this before in our podcast, there's not a bigger podcast audience. As far as comedians go, they used to want to be on late night. And if they made it on late night, I mean, they really made it. You're going to get popular. Joe Rogan's the new late night. If you make it on Joe Rogan's show, you're going to sell, you're going to be a bestseller. People are going to know you. He gets tens of millions of downloads per episode, hundreds of millions per month. I think he's nears 2 billion downloads per year for people on his shows. So, you know, people know him. And this woman, Dr. Anna Lemke, made an appearance on her show. Everything that she said, and then Rogan's positive and sort of reinforcing reaction to her claims suggests something about our friend Carl Hart's ability to permeate our culture, let's say our cultural willful ignorance about drugs and addiction. But I'm going to get to that. That's something I'm going to get to in just a second.
Did they mention Carl Hart?
I didn't see that they did, although I'll admit something. I didn't make it through. He had her on for 3 hours. Rogan has a thing. If he has a guest on, unless it's someone who's just passing through town and has a plane to catch, usually if he has a guest on for an hour, hour and a half, he's not interested. And so they'll sign off. All right, we got to go. If he has a guest on for over 2 hours or 3 hours, he's interested in that person. He wants to keep talking. It's worth his audience's time. So they were over 3 hours, and I think I made it maybe almost 2 hours the way through, but enough to catch, you know, the gist.
But the idea.
Yeah, and so basically she's saying what everyone, one of those things that you can't go wrong saying, and she happens to be one of the people that the intellectual milieu sort of relies on to be the mouthpiece for the idea that addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease, that it's dopaminergic at its core, and everything else sort of follows from that. So what I'm going to do is play a clip from, actually I'll play 2 clips, but I'm going to play one now, and then we can respond to a few things she said together. Mind you, I could have played a million clips from what she said. At one point she talked about there being addiction gremlins, she's speaking figuratively, but gremlins in your brain that really want you to do some sort of behavior or drug again, and you just can't get to it. But this, I think, is a better summation of what she's trying to say here.
Now, the thing about addiction and the way that it changes our brains is that thing that initially is pleasurable and has us engaging in approach behaviors, if we continue to consume that substance or engage in that behavior, it ultimately actually puts us in a dopamine deficit state such that we want to continue to do that behavior, not to feel good, but just to stop feeling bad. And that's kind of one of the fundamental things about the disease of addiction. It's innate vulnerability to start, added to the changes that occur in the brain as a result of ongoing consumption of our drug. And those brain changes are what drive continued compulsive use.
She says these really obvious yet meaningless kinds of things like, well, if you're in an area that there's a greater supply of what she calls addictive substances. So, you know, she fails to address what that even means, but she says, then of course you have a higher risk of becoming addicted, but also if you have a tendency to seek a thrill, or if you're a person who's natural disposition is to want to continue pleasure and sort of outframe everything else, then you're much more likely to be addicted, and you can't quite know who you are in that case until you've done the drug. So it's best not to.
Does she say those are non-biological or biological factors?
She's saying those are biological. She's saying we're tackling the nature side now. And so, and lastly, she talks about inheritance and genetics. She also says, well, on the nurture side of things, if you've experienced great degrees of trauma in your past, then you're likely to become more addicted. Then you're more likely to become addicted. And she does grant that addiction is to more than just drugs, but when she switches back and forth. So when she's talking about addiction in this case, she's talking about to drugs. And when she's talking about trauma and everything, she's talking about that's a vulnerability for becoming addicted to drugs. Funny enough, I know you and I think about trauma and trauma theory as actually a very biological one, a very much a nature claim. So I think I've done it. I mean, it was not the way she said it, but I think I've done it justice. So love to get your response.
Now, would you not agree that when Carl Hart's talking about addiction, he tends to talk about opioids?
I agree with that. Let's get to that later, though. Let's just
okay.
Respond to her claims, and then I'll get.
So she's describing, and I guess the key element always is, well, so she has an elaborate set of factors to explain the fact. Does she acknowledge that most people don't become addicted to opioids? Does she go there?
I never heard her actually say that. I think she does go there, but
people are buying, it's a mix and match thing. Sort of everybody in America thinks all opioids are addictive. And if you take them, you become addicted. And Carl says not. Mm-hmm. And so more or less, they splice in, well, and I thought that's where you were going. Well, these are the factors that make you more susceptible to addiction to painkillers. Because the most casual observation will tell you, well, in the exercise that I do, if I ask the audience, have you ever taken an opioid painkiller? Everybody raise their hand. I say, how many became addicted? Nobody became addicted in that audience.
So she is trying to grapple with the fact, whether she says it explicitly or not, it's possible that she does, and I missed this. I think I would have noticed if she said, well, most people don't become addicted to them. I don't think Rogan even ever brought that up. And we're going to get to Carl. It was just, it's too too easy right now to turn to Carl Hart and, Rogan's responses. But she's trying to grapple with the fact that people don't become addicted to drugs or things. So what's going on with that? And she uses dopamine as the explainer of that. Like, well, how well do people biologically self-regulate their dopamine? She turns it all into a magical brain act. I mean, this is like Nora Volkow in 2007.
So the first question, I would say, I don't have a question. I just have a phrase for you. I would say to her, deaths of despair. Mm-hmm. Because sort of everybody in America now knows that opioid deaths are unequally distributed. That's sort of become known, but people aren't good at segueing that into, the addiction model. Everybody's getting dopamine, but only some people are dying. Taking enough
trauma is her response to that, which is why trauma, it has to be a biological sort of argument, because trauma is her response to, well, deaths of despair. Because, well, all those people, according to her, obviously she hasn't thought about this in great detail, but all of those people have experienced some adverse events. And so they're much more likely to become addicted and have a dysregulated,
and that mediates through the brain.
Right. And so she calls that a nurture sort of reason for people becoming addicted. But at the end, it's all about the brain. And if it's all about the brain, then that's inherently a biological argument.
Now, one of the things that Nora Volkow precedes her lectures with now I mean, Nora Volkow sounds more complex than this woman because the psychiatrist, because Nora Volkow acknowledges that most people outgrow addiction. And so that's another layer to fit. The most obvious layers to fit in are, well, not everybody becomes addicted. The people who are more likely to become addicted are very socially determined. Mm-hmm. And most people outgrow addiction. Although she's not limiting herself to opioids, or she is, would she?
No, she doesn't limit herself. She wrote a book about opioids, that there's an opioid crisis and doctors cause the crisis. We can get to that if you want to, but she is saying that addiction could be to anything. And
does she describe it? Does she think that Rogan is addicted to marijuana and alcohol?
I don't think she is. She talks about the concept of negative consequences, and she does believe everything's on balance. So it's like she has patients come to her and say, they even talked about actually what they really talked about is Joe's tendency to play video games, just, and kind of shadowing out his social relationships because of video games and that being unhealthy. And she discussed other sort of addictions that are not drug related. And even with those, she uses dopamine to explain why that happens. It's this rush that you get from dopamine. And once you've had it enough, your brain is saying, well, I need more of it. I need more of it. Her explainer here, which involves drugs too, not only does she not say, well, most people outgrow addiction, she says the whole dopamine thing, the system gone awry, is the reason why it's so hard for people to quit their addictions. When they try to abstain, even months, even years later, they have this thing gnawing on them, telling them that you need this pleasure reward. So they go back to it. And it's very, 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 very hard for somebody to totally remit or stop this process from happening.
So, I'm aware of the American model of addiction for quite a long time. And it's been basically, drug oriented for 100 years. And she's successful because she recasts the standard criminals, all the usual suspects, into a new model, the dopamine model, without ever asking a question of why do most people not become addicted? Why do most people become addicted, overcome addiction? Does one neurochemical, dopamine, really explain every type of addiction? But you don't remember, did she mention any specific? Oh, she mentioned gaming. Because gaming has been recognized by the European Psychiatric Manual, the International Classification of Diseases, but not DSM. We're going to get.
She thinks it's everything. I mean,
social media addiction is something that's very much in the news. We're going to get into it a little bit more. It's very much in the medical news. Did she say anything that was new to you?
There was nothing new, but except for, I guess I've never really heard someone able to fit in sort of a universal model of addiction, not that includes non-drug involvements, that includes all of life, that talks about the balancing act of consequences that may be negative or they may be conducive for living your best life. Someone who obviously has reasonable conversations with their clients, but still be able to fold that all into this dopaminergic model, and not even dopamine plus whatever other hand wavy brain function she wants to talk about, but it's just dopamine. The last clip I was going to play for you, well, let me talk about Carl Hart first.
Good.
Because as you say, here's what I want to say about Carl. Carl, for people who don't know, if you're listening to us, you know him, but he's the Ziff Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at Columbia University. And he's written 2 bestsellers, both about the idea that drugs get a bad rap. And so when it comes to the problems that we think that drugs cause, well, it's not really about the drugs at all. And you mentioned previously that Carl is right within the frame in which he's embedded himself. But if you were going to consult him, you would encourage him to put forth a solid addiction conceptualization, or else all of the let's say, outreach that he's doing right now is going to be useless. And I have I've had mixed responses to that way of thinking. And one is that, well, he's in his lane and he's making great headway in that lane. Someone needs to put forth a solid addiction conceptualization. But maybe it doesn't need to be him. At least he implies enough or is sensible enough that if he heard a good one, he would, he could tack onto it. And if he hears a stupid one, that he'll disagree with it. On the other hand, I give you complete credit. As I was watching this, I was thinking about things that you've said about that. Because Carl Hart went on Rogan. He had Joe Rogan lapping up everything that he was saying about drugs not being the problem and so forth. And yet months later only, Joe has Anna Lemke on the show convincing Rogan that dopamine is the reason for addictions of all kinds, and it's the result of drugs and brain changes. So what's your response to that?
One thing you and I know is that Carl's going to reject some brain chemical model for addiction. I mean,
right, sure.
If somebody said, he would just make a face. If somebody says,
right,
"Oh, dopamine causes addiction," I mean,
I can hear him right now. Oh, come on, man.
It's not bad. He usually reserves that if somebody personally attacks him. In the video you had, one of the guys said, "Are you on drugs right now?" And he goes,
"Oh, that's right, that's right.
Man.
Oh, come on, man."
Have you ever heard Carl refer to? I mean, here's the bad news. This psychiatrist is myth making, and it's the same myth that we've had for 100 more years. But she's expanded her myth beyond narcotics and drugs. Have you ever heard of Carl refer to anything as being addictive other than alcohol and heroin?
No, and that's the thing. He's not interested in that as much. I mean, maybe you've heard him talk about how
maybe meth.
well, yeah, but drugs in general. But I've heard him expand it, but he doesn't go the distance with it. So I'll give you that.
So her model permits her, forgive me for putting it this way, her model, delusional and non-empirically based as it is, allows her she can deploy it in areas that Carl doesn't. Yes. Carl's mainly interested in saying, well, there's no brain mechanism for addiction. And, he doesn't, as I've said, in his book, he refers to, and I have to give Andrew Tatarsky's review credit. He refers to addiction and substance use disorder as the same kernel. It's sort of like bad things happen. He's usually sort of saying, well, a small percentage, 10 to 20% of people have negative outcomes, but he doesn't differentiate among those outcomes. He doesn't talk about addiction versus, which is another thing that's wrong with this model by this person. Negative outcome. I mean, DSM doesn't use the word addiction. It doesn't use the word dependence. And there's actually that's good. DSM has some harm reduction elements in it. DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. Because things don't all pile up in an addiction bottle. If you're looking for, well, how many people are addicted? They can't go without taking heroin for a couple of hours. They go through extreme. There's not that many people like that. Right. People's behaviors all kinds of vary. And why they are now into the concept they use now is opioid use disorder is because what they're saying is, well, it's sort of the amount of bad things that happen to you piled up. Here's a bunch of them. And if enough bad things happen, we call it a severe disorder, then a moderate disorder and a mild disorder. And that actually, although we talk about addiction, I certainly talk about addiction as the end point. I wonder about our client base. Does everybody who comes in, are they really addicted? We have the Life Process program, and most of our clients aren't addicted type people. And we have a concept of addiction, but that's sort of like at one end of things. And we're talking about, well, what kinds of bad things are happening? How come you keep doing the same thing, even though it has negative consequences? How often do you do it? But we're just not tied down to like people being addicted, because you might say, well, our clients aren't that likely to be addicted. And really, in the universe, not that many people are that likely to be addicted. The people that you know that everybody sees on television or imagines, more television programs have gotten somewhat subtler. They'll imply that somebody has a drug problem, but they don't show them. There's a famous film called The Man with the Golden Arm, where, you know, the guy climbs the wall, Frank Sinatra climbs the wall, through which wall. They don't show that so much anymore. And how can I put this? People who are making television programs are more realistic than the people that Rogan has on his show.
So you mentioned this last week.
I think that Rogan might know that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in some ways, I watch him and I'm like, wow, this meathead's a real thinker. He's really actually thinking about this, but he can't seem to keep the string of ideas that he gets from guests into one logical sequence in his mind. It just jumps from one to the other. But in this case, I think anyone could have made them. If you're naive about what addiction is, like Rogan is, and he heard Carl Hart talking about drugs not being the problem, I could see him thinking, okay, maybe drugs aren't the problem and this woman's right. You know, there's ways.
A quick rundown on how that would work.
Well, it just happens to work. I mean, it just happens to be the case. I mean, what I'm saying to you is that people buy onto Carl's argument and they still are wedded to the disease model. Yeah. And so I don't know how you resolve that dialectic in some way, but people do.
That people who are criticized, I mean, I don't know, it's hard to judge who's more popular or famous. But Johan Hari's famous, and he goes out and attacks the disease theory, and then, you know, people go home and believe the same old thing. My approach to that is to confront people directly with the contradiction. I'm famous for that. Like where I ask people, have you taken an opioid painkiller? Did you become addicted? Why not? And then I'll take it a second level, which I got to give credit. I got it from Jacob Solom. Did you feel kind of impelled to take some more of it? Like, did you say, that worked for me? And people will say that. Then I'll say, did you? And they'll say, oh, no. And then when you say, well, why didn't you? And they'll just say, well, I have children, or I have a job and I have to get up and drive them in the morning. So you would say to that psychiatrist, are people who are, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of data that show that people are more likely to overcome a dependence if they're married, if they have a job, if they have things weighing the other side of the scale down, which is so commonsensical and logical. And, you would say, you could ask the woman questions. Are people who are employed just as likely to become addicted and just as unlikely to overcome the addiction as people who don't have any kind of job or any kind of skills training? And of course, we have the Life Process program, which works on the exact opposite model, which is data laden. It depends what you consider science to be. These people have these schematic views of the brain, which mean nothing. And, we say, well, when you look at epidemiological research, you can get a very strong predictive model. The person who most does this is Gene Heyman, of who will become addicted and who will be slowest to overcome addiction based on these predictive variables: education, marriage, being tied down into a community. And then, sometimes Gene Heyman gets almost poetic. He almost slips into sounding like me. He'll say, what it sort of gets down to is people saying, I'm quitting because it's too much of a burden to my psyche and my family, and I'm too embarrassed. That's what his bottom line, after all those data.
So let me tell you the difference between, not that you don't know, but let me expound and illuminate the differences between you and Anna Lemke. You follow a model, a theoretical model that's just reality based. And so your clinical work matches that. She does the opposite. She has clients, the way that she explained talking to her clients, let's take the negative consequences bit. Joe was saying, well, so what's the difference between, you play golf all the time. What is that addiction? She said, well, the negative consequences. And he said, well, like what? And she said, well, maybe someone plays golf all the time, but their wife is saying, golly, you're out too much. And he said, well, maybe they need to get a new wife. And she said, well, that's, something that gets brought up. People come into me and they ask, just how much is this how much should I be changing my life? Yeah, am I too involved? And she says to them practically, that's a great question, and I can't answer that for you, but maybe we can kind of tackle that together. Which thing do you prefer? Which benefits does it give you? Do you think that you could do one more? She asks all the basic practical questions. So when she's talking about how she deals with human beings, it's virtually identical to the way that we approach human beings, at least in the way she says it. But
that way, the thing that makes it clear that the brain model is, it's not only bullshit, but
well, hold on. I have the second part of that is that at the same time that she's able to talk about human beings that way, a mano a mano kind of a thing. She made this claim, and I'll let you. This is the next clip I was going to play, but it's not working. They were talking about athletes, and Joe was saying, "All right, so there's some superior athletes. They train. Their whole life is training. Their whole life is achievement. Their whole life is, they track their nutrients down to the last calorie every day. They're at their best. So what do you say to that?" And she said, "Yeah, people reward them for that, and you might say they could feel more or less successful." But at the end of the day, their careers are over. I have a hunch that a lot of them, when that dopamine wears off, then they're starting to come down on the other end. She can't, for some reason. I don't think she would say that to a client. But as soon as it stops being person to person kind of a thing and it's theoretical again, she leans so heavily on dopamine. It's not like she couldn't talk about it like, well, an athlete will have to find other involvements in their lives to make them happy. It's, well, this is scary because once the dopamine wears off, they'll be on a come down, and that's bad. So she can't match the two. And that, I think that relates to the thing that you wanted to bring up next. You were in the middle of saying.
And what we call reductionism is a matter of translating common sense into reputed biological mechanisms, and they never quite work as well as common sense.
That's right.
Because obviously, you look at some athletes retire and they get into sportscasting because they have a skill set, like they're good talkers or they're personable, or I don't know. One of my heroes is Jerry West. Jerry West was abused. He was, 6'1" white guy who was one of the greatest basketball players of all time. He was abused as a child, and he played basketball all the time. He sort of couldn't talk to anybody, and he had a famous Tweety-like voice, and everybody made fun of him. But then he became general manager of the Lakers, and then he became consultant for the Golden State Warriors. When they became champions, he expanded his natural gifts into areas where he was not only traumatized, but he was famous for being bad at them. He just wasn't a good talker. And I know what we talked about this before. When you have a child that you're working with and they get involved in an activity, sometimes that activity will be very similar to the thing they end up doing for a career. But other times it's just they're learning meta skills. They're not going to become like a great
Right.
professional soccer player or gymnast, but they're learning what it means to be successful and to persist in an activity. And of course, obviously, there's a ton of athletes who are like that. I mean, especially considering a lot of professional athletes come from down under backgrounds like Jerry West, and then they become highly successful. You have to say, well, I don't think Jerry West would be a famous millionaire living in the Hollywood Hills if he wasn't a great basketball player. And then that was an avenue towards him developing and practicing his skills in other areas. I mean, it's another example of whereby the common sense explanation is, if for most people who have success in the arts and in sports and in specialized areas, that generally is a bridge to a more successful life, not to a less. They don't have, not more of them. Jerry West is from Appalachia.
Right.
A ton more of his friends who weren't All-American, All-Pro basketball players are dead than Jerry West isn't dead. So we're on a theme here, and I get.
I'm so sorry. Let me say one more thing, because you mentioned the way I work with kids. Something I've asked teachers before, and it's profound the way that they sort of snap out of a cloud when I say this. I've been asked, what should I do with this student? And I sometimes ask, what would you do if it were your kid? And they think about it in a different way. And for Anna Lemke
that's a funny statement already. If they switch to, oh, I don't have my professional hat on, let's think about a kid I care about.
Right.
They go in a different
exactly. Yeah, right. So what if it is almost like, this is your student, you're supposed to care about them. And I'm sort of saying, what if this was someone you cared about? What would you do? Oh, I would. And I think, the idea of, you shouldn't become an elite athlete because there could be a come down. You wouldn't. I don't think Anna Lemke would say it to a family member, and I don't even think she would say it to a client. So she really can't reconcile those two things. But anyway, that was a digression.
Knows that they want to encourage their kid to have high self-esteem, to make healthy choices. Every middle class adult, and even everybody knows you want your child to get involved in positive activities. Everybody knows the basic parenting activities. They maybe have more or less skills or opportunities to make that happen. It's almost like the way you're putting it is, oh, I've got my miner's hat with that light on it now, and I'm dealing with a kid who's got a diagnosis. So I have to throw out everything I actually know in my actual life that I try to practice.
All right, so I've been stalling you on.
No,
you wanted to discuss an article in
what you bring up is dealing with real people. You deal with reductionism every day, or certain, regularly. Let's put it that way, where you have to sort of switch people to like thinking about. I was going to say, Nora Volkow did a big series on HBO called Addiction, and she went through all that. Forgive me, I know this is impolitic of me, bullshit. And the thing on treatment was motivational interviewing, which is what you said Lemke does. Forget that's so great, the brain scans, and look, that part of the brain lights up. It's so fabulous. Now what? And it's been 50 years and they have nothing to do about that. They don't go in with, as well, Sally Sattel's good at this. They don't go in with, some kind of probe and fix that part of there's things they can fix in your heart that way. But they don't have things they can fix in your brain, and you're not addictive. So I got a mailing called Dopamine and Reward, the story of social media. You know, you just know how this one's going to go, don't you? The addictive nature of social, this is in Medscape. The addictive nature of social media has previously been called out as analogous to the addictive nature of gambling. That's a funny way of putting it. What would I object to that sentence? It's analogous to nature of gambling. Aren't we talking about addiction? And if she believes that addiction, social media are addictive, why is she talking about analogies? Oh, it's analogous. And what's it analogous to? It's not even analogous to heroin addiction. It's almost like she's going wink, wink. Well, we know this isn't really addictive, but sometimes people talk about, well, gambling's in DSM-5. So maybe she's figuring, well, although her problem is the DSM-5 specifically ruled out gaming addiction. Let's think about it. Whether you're on Instagram, TikTok, or a similar platform, you can't help but scroll from one video to the next. It's one 5 to 10 second video after the next, and before you know it, you've spent the past hour going through random videos, but you can't stop. It's a phenomenological experiential description. Say, well, this is what people do. But now she has a paragraph to leap into Lemke land and Volkow land. Social media actually, and then she puts it in quotations. Once again, they claim they believe these things, but rewires, and she has quotation marks around it. That's to say, well, let's not get crazy and think this is actually true. Our brain's such that we expect instant gratification. In other words, when we get a notification message like or share, we expect fast and short-term pleasure reward because the brain will produce a hit of dopamine. Quotation marks again. They don't believe their own bullshit. However,
what would they be quoting? You can't just say that it's real. Yeah, you have to put quotes around it to save your ass. Yeah.
However, it is important to note that the reward system is not delimited to the dopaminergic pathway. She's actually better than Lemke.
I was just about to say that. At least she doesn't limit it to dopamine.
And in fact, should be understood as a complex network system, e.g., governed by changes in brain morphology through addiction and excessive behavior. Given the quick pace of the social media world, the reward pathways in our brains change, and there's an increasing demand for attention, perpetuating an addictive mindset. Well, now she's back to screw all that brain stuff, which she knows nothing about. You know, well, she's mentioned dopamine and brain morphology in two words, and now she's back to talking about real people. Mm-hmm. As the platform for communications, well, when we refresh our page, we expect instant gratification. We got that before. But what happens when we don't get a like or a message or some sort of reward? So you can envision that. You're a person, you put yourself out on a limb. You're not super popular. Maybe people put you down. What's that like? Before we knew about dopamine, we could all understand that experience. You know what I mean? Not being that liked. People knew about this in the 1950s and in the 1850s. But what happens when we don't get a like? Recounts of social media use by adolescents have likened online attention to popularity. I'd say so. I wouldn't say that was such a giant leap. Accordingly, a lack of constant attention in social media has created a vicious cycle of anxiety, loneliness, and depression due to a failure to receive virtual reward. Oh, she has virtual in quotes. She just said it's like popularity just through the media. She has a difficulty. She keeps claiming that things are the same, but she doesn't believe it. So she has to put everything in quotes. Taken together, social media may be harmful by distorting our self-image, and while social media platforms help connect us, they can also ironically make us feel isolated, lower our self-confidence, and diminish our overall sense of well-being. So she's describing an experience that people knew about, as I said, before they ever heard of dopamine, where, you know, you try to be popular, maybe you make an effort, you don't feel good about the feedback. Maybe it isn't good feedback, maybe you're insecure, and then you feel more stressed and depressed as a result of that, and you make a greater effort and outreach to try and gain that approval. And if you're after one, say, partner, and you do that, you can see that addictive love cycle where you're yearning for a person and you're really uncertain and feeling bad about how they react to you. And, you know, you go into a deeper depression and then you yearn for them more. So,
ironically, doesn't that sound like what it could be like to be a journalist who puts everything in quotes? I mean, could you imagine you're trying to sell something about yourself, and you could do that as a person who's stable, balanced, feels good about their lives, and you put everything out there. People could review it negatively or positively, and you could let the negatives bounce off of you, or you could be a person who wraps up your self-esteem in your journalism, and if it gets a negative review,
well, you know, I wrote a memoir. It's in the back of you. I've gotten a lot of negative feedback in my life. And I get a lot of negative feedback now. I'm far from revered. And nobody endures that with total equanimity, but I endure it better than average. You know, I have a certain, people would say, oh, Nick Heather once said about me, oh, you have a really thick skin. Oh, you make jokes about everything. But, you know, and people sort of know this when they have children. You know, they know to say to the child, well, those people didn't like you. They don't know what a good person is. Everybody knows that you have to reinforce the internal module of a young person because everybody gets negative feedback. That's for sure. And you want your child to be able to overcome that. And of course, the big thing now about Instagram is young teen girls are especially susceptible to wanting to be approved of and to wanting to be found attractive. And so, you know, I was watching on MSNBC and they were doing a show on that. And one of the women said, I wish somebody would tell them that, you know, not everybody's, you know, going to be attractive in the same way. And what I thought was, they've heard that message 5 million times, but somehow that's a hard message to take in when you're young and when you're maybe a teenage girl. So what's the answer then? How do you prevent a person from going overboard because, you know, they're not close to being the most popular kid on the internet or in their class? How do you prevent them from dipping down into depression and anxiety?
Well, should we leave on the table complete abstinence from social media forever?
She actually, that's an interesting question. As the platforms for communication and information have evolved so rapidly over the past decade, there is a need to establish boundaries between what is beneficial and what is detrimental to your mental, potentially detrimental. Every once in a while, she breaks out in just a bold, there's no quotation marks in that sentence. She just says something that's true. You're not going to be able to function. You can't even do your homework now, obviously, if you don't know how to use social media and internet.
Right.
That's not going to make you a happy person. Oh, I told my son or daughter, and of course it's parallel to drugs and alcohol, which I mentioned bringing up with Skenazy. Well, just never use any of them. Of course, that's different than limiting it, obviously. But I mean, how do you prevent a young girl or any teenage girl or anybody from going over the cliff by getting sucked into Instagram with its natural trials and potential depression causing blowback.
Yeah, by nurturing and supporting an otherwise fulfilled life, which is what I was saying. I don't know if you caught it, but what I'm saying is, in sort of a meta point, is that all these experiences potentials that she's describing, I imagine she faces those same potentials as in her career as a writer here. And so how does she deal with it? You know, or I don't know if it's a she, the person writing.
I thought your answer caught everything in one sentence by developing a fulfilling life. The reason your daughter's not going to sit in her room chugging all night on social feedback or whatever is because she can sit down and do something positive and entertain herself and enjoy it.
Right.
The problem with addiction theory is it's so simple and stupid, I guess, that anybody doesn't want to talk about it. I mean, the thing that makes you most gratified about a child, it was then they get involved in a positive activity, they like it, they're good at it, and they get positive feedback from it.
That's so obvious that if there are still problems, despite us all knowing that, well, there must be something more complicated. It couldn't be that we could do a better job, you know, of doing what we know is right. It has to be that everything's more complex than we think.
And the problem is that job is simple but hard.
Yes.
And sometimes it goes wrong. Sometimes, you
Right.
can't say. And so we want some kind of a crazy ass shortcut. Like you could just if you brought a couple of ratchets, pliers, wrenches, you could screw the people's brains around right and everything will be great. And, like a beautiful boy, he goes through hell and then he ends up being a good writer, because he has those skills and he writes books and he gives lectures. It's called a life, and he's got a girlfriend and a dog. Okay. And he's, to judge from when I see Nick Sheff talk about his life, or his son, David Sheff talks about his son, it doesn't take too much to make for a satisfied human being. It's just that sometimes those not too much things seem hard to acquire and very elusive and out of your grasp.
So Maya Solovitz said to me, and I get down on you sometimes for being too hard on people, but I'll be hard on Maya here. I mentioned all of those things to her. She said, well, yeah, but you can't prescribe that. And my answer to her was, yeah, well, I try to, because what else?
Right. And Maya's a perfect example of it. She was a brilliant but disgruntled and dissatisfied young person. Now she's married and people know she's got a lot to offer. And so she was a socially awkward person that took a while to, same as Mark Lewis and others. Carl Hart's funny. He's different from them because he was kind of always socially attractive and appealing. He was a good athlete and he was a kind of a disc jockey. So he didn't have that thing of where he was like crushed, even though, compared to Maya, his background was 1,000 times more traumatic, but he had a stronger core. And so he had to come around the block to get to the point of saying, well, I took some drugs and a lot of people near me took drugs and their lives went completely downhill, but that didn't happen to me. And he had to work his way through that logic, through that pattern. And so, the answers aren't hard, but performing them is hard, and performing them on a large scale is very hard, because we're not talking about, in general, people, addiction theory people, their children are better off. I mean, a thing that happens to me a ton is I'm on some kind of not as much anymore. I would be on a workshop and I'll be with 3 recovering people. And I always say to do the same trick. And it always works. I say, what are your children like? And they say, oh, thank God, you know, my kid's a moderate drinker. He's got a girlfriend or she's married. And I say, I wonder how that happened. Because usually the person you're talking to was traumatized or had an addicted parent themselves. And then I say, well, you know, you're up here, forgive me, spewing this bullshit, and yet you've actually performed kind of a miracle. You have an addictive legacy that you fell prey to, but now your kids are just like normal.
Sort of another version of what would you do if it were your kid? You'd turn it back and say, what are your kids like?
And how did you do it?
Right.
And it's like, you know, climbing the moon for them to sort of say, and I do this, you know, I go, let me guess, I'll tell you how you did it. You realize that you had to create a stable home. You had a good job by the time, you know, you're now some kind of recovery coach. You knew to praise your children. You knew to avoid, you know, over conflict. You knew to reward them in areas that gave them strong suits. You know, you knew that they had to pursue something that was going to be productive. In other words, you were a normal, you know, I don't want to give you a swelled head, but you were a normal parent, pretty good parent. And you know, being in recovery got you to that point. And that's what it's really all about. So we've come back to children again. We've got a children's specialty. We've gone through Rogan again, and we wondered about how one man can love Carl Hart, and what's the woman's name?
Anna Lemke. I think I'm saying it right. I might be mispronouncing.
And how come the world will be believing I'm going to die before, and they'll still be doing, the most advanced thinking people still be doing dopamine podcast. He's a little behind the 8 ball on that one. It's not quite as big as it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
When she was interviewed in 2007, or maybe it was 2005, just after she had been appointed, the headline was, "A General in the Drug War, it's all about the dopamine." Nora Volkow must say it 20 times a day. She doesn't say it's all about the dopamine 20 times a day anymore.
Right.
So we're, you know, we're swimming upstream, but isn't that what this program is about? And my memoir is about? You have to persist despite a little negative feedback if you're going to accomplish something in life. You and I, me more, but both of us maybe get more negative feedback than average. So
and the good news is that the normal life basic elements that the parents, the people think about their loved ones, that, you know, what it means to live a good life, those are the addiction antidote. And of course, the bad news is that people try with those things and sometimes come up short. The good news is that there's nothing really bogging anybody down from trying again or continuing to pursue their best lives. And the other good news is that we don't have to terrify ourselves about that concept more than it's already terrifying. So the idea that the short way out of it is, well, let's worry everybody about, you know, neurochemistry. That way no one will ever try a drug. You don't have to get into that realm. I mean, no one has to be so terrified.
You almost, when you pre-interviewed Lenora, I thought she said, "Oh, I'm worried about drugs." You know, probably because she's just reading the newspaper and watching television.
Yeah.
And ironically, to me, you have to give her the message, well, just follow your own philosophy.
Right.
Give your kid independence, and they'll learn skills, and they'll learn to rely on themselves. And that's the antidote to that vague thing you're worried about, which hasn't happened, and it's not going to really happen. Rogan has 10 billion listeners. We're working our way up.
Well, in the meantime, stay off social media because you never know what's going to happen.
Isn't this social media?
Yeah, whatever we're doing. I mean, I don't think you can even not be on social
And
media.
I'm reading my iPhone. I'm doing ejecting in both your arms.
Right.
Bye-bye, Zach.
See you later, Stanton.